Emergency update. So this is the radioactivity environmental monitoring map of the European Commission. What it does is it aggregates data from a variety of different radiological sensors that are spread throughout Eastern and Western Europe, and it gives us a real-time readout of what the exposure levels of radioactivity are in any given region. As of now, at around 2 p.m. Mountain Time here in North America, it is looking like 99.9% of species are within the realm of healthy dose of exposure under 200 nanosieverts per hour. The reason why I'm showing you this map is that if the events unfold as projected based on the growing volume of empirical and anecdotal evidence that I'm about to share with you today, these types of maps are going to become commonplace. They're going to gain in popularity, and you're going to see maps like this all over the news. Now, today on the channel, what I want to do is I want to further enumerate all of the data points that I brought to your attention in the car video that I did a couple days ago. I'm going to show you a few videos, and we're just going to list off all the bullet points so you can see with your own eyes why it appears as though something is being cooked up. Whether it's by the Russians or the Ukrainians, I'll leave that part for you to decide. I have my speculations about that. First, I'm going to list off the data, and then we're going to break it down and we're going to try to weave it into some fine tapestry of speculation as we typically do. Now, again, I'm saying this stuff because I want people to be aware. I want you to be ahead of the panic curve. I don't want you to panic, which is why we try to put two and two together and we try to constellate exactly what might be happening here. So we have Zelensky's Rivne address. Zelensky appealed against the backdrop of a nuclear power plant. This was just yesterday, and it's important to note that all of these data points are from the last week. This is just from the last week, and it's ratcheted up in terms of its frequency, intensity of the message as of late. So we have evacuations as of today on July 2nd. This news just came out an hour ago that 100 personnel were evacuated from the power plant. These personnel, of course, are required to work the power plant. Now, it's unknown as to whether or not these people have been evacuated due to the fact that there's not as much to do anymore because the reactors have been shut down, or is it in anticipation of some sort of incident? Who knows? Zelensky has issued repeated warnings that have increased in intensity that Russia is planning something in his previous nightly addresses for the past week. Okay, every night he's talking about this. You also have Ukrainian intel corroborating this, saying that the risk level is the highest ever. You have a U.S. resolution that was proposed just a few days ago by Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal, who said that if there is any radiological incident, be it the detonation of a tactical nuclear weapon or a incident at a power plant, any of the 5 or I think there's 4 power plants, nuclear power plants in Ukraine. This is the one we're talking about, just in case you don't know what we're talking about. There are 6 reactors on the now drained reservoir of the Dnieper River. So if there is any incident there, that US and NATO would have license to get involved in this conflict. Permanent evacuation of places within 16 kilometers. Permanent evacuation within 16 kilometers of the nuclear power plant. It's important to know also that in and around this nuclear power plant, the water levels are significantly down as a result of the dam being blown, meaning that it's much easier to come across the river in those regions. I would presume you probably need some sort of amphibious vehicle, but it's more achievable than it was before. In the last 24 hours, a U.S. nuclear WC-135 sniffing plane that detects radiation was sent to this area. This is called the Constant Phoenix, and we actually have video footage of that in operation. We have the Ukrainian civil defense and emergency teams conducting heightened amounts of CBRN and training and drills, and they've made this very public. There's plenty of footage of them doing this. I can't show you the actual footage because the video might get flagged because of some of the exercises that they're simulating with people on stretchers, but know that it is happening. Energoatom is also doing 2 days of exercises. That is the Ukrainian nuclear agency that oversees all of their nuclear facilities. So they're conducting their own exercises. There has been widespread distribution of potassium iodide, and it's also being cleared out of pharmacies in and around the region in the run-up to some radiological incident. Lower water levels around the plant also contributes to a lower cooling pond. Now, the IAEA has said that this is not a concern, that there's enough water on hand and the ability to pump water for up to 6 months, so that the lower water levels as a result of the dam being blown are not an imminent threat to the nuclear situation. But of course, that could all change when you throw in a variety of different factors. Now, there have been reports, and this is according to Ukrainian intel, that buildings have been mined and that 4 of the 6 reactors and spent fuel pools have been mined, or explosive trucks have been placed near them. Now, Ukraine is making the argument that they would not be able to do this, and that the Russians would be the only people who are able to do this because of the fact that these facilities are so hardened. Now, I don't know with respect to the spent fuel pools, but I do know that that is true for the nuclear reactors, that they are built to withstand a couple hits of a jumbo jet. So it's very likely that if you are going to pull off an operation like this, it will require special forces, it will require saboteurs, it will require a lot of intel on the inside. It's also important to note that this is a massive facility, okay? It's like a small city, the size of this facility. It's very, very large, and it would be very difficult to completely 100% secure the facility all the time, especially if they are currently evacuating that facility. So there are some arguments to be made that, well, indeed, it would be difficult for Ukraine to pull this off, that it would not be impossible, okay? Ukraine claims that Russia is not allowing UN officials to certain parts of the plan. Rafael Grossi, the IAEA director, is on site, or has people on site. I'm not sure if he's on site himself physically, but he has said that there's no evidence to suggest that, but he kind of left it a little bit open-ended, and I'll show you the video. It's a little bit suspicious, okay? Now, perhaps most importantly is that there's a looming 2.0 counteroffensive that's about to happen in that direction. This is corroborated by the movement of Russian forces into the region and the bolstering of forces in around Melitopol, in anticipation that the Ukrainians are going to be doing some sort of blitzkrieg maneuver in that direction. Now, this is very important, because whether this counteroffensive succeeds or not, all they have to do is give it the old college try. And if they did have people on the ground that were capable of doing some sort of detonation or generating the radiological incident that they need to bring NATO into the conflict, then all they need to do is make a significant thrust in that direction, and they could make the argument that, well, we were on the brink of victory, even if they aren't victorious, and that this is the motive for Russia to do this, to try to slow us down. Russia lacks a lot of initiative to do this, and in fact is disincentivized by the fact that NATO could potentially get involved if it happens. So there's not a whole lot of reasons why Russia would benefit from this. In fact, they would almost benefit by letting Ukraine just take it outright and trying to fight to get it back in the future. Now, is Ukraine sending out signals that if they get a hold of the facility and they can't hold it, that they will blow it up? That's something for you to consider. Now, Vilnius summit deadline approaching. This one is a bit more speculative, but it's the truth that on July 11th and 12th, President Biden himself is going to be making an appearance at the summit in Vilnius, just a couple hundred kilometers away from the Wagner Group and Belarus's tactical nuclear missiles. That is very significant. This is a very important summit, which will have huge repercussions in terms of Ukraine's ability to integrate into the NATO alliance, and whether or not there is an action plan laid out, whether or not there's a timeline laid out, whether or not there's security guarantees, whether or not there's going to be some peacekeeping coalition of the willing that are going to go into Ukraine and help them secure various facilities, possibly nuclear facilities. That's already being floated in the independent media, and I'm talking about the sub-mainstream independent media like The Independent, The Telegraph, The Daily Cause, Vice. Those types of agencies are not what I consider alternative, but they're sub-mainstream because they tend to echo the mainstream narrative, but they have a bit more edginess to them, they are all saying that the solution is to send in special forces. In fact, we got the 101st Airborne right there in Romania. We may as well send them in to do the job. Now, this actually is not a bad idea, because if they were to do something like this, if it was even possible, if they can even get across the river and not get shot down, or make it across the river in the first place, they could use the nuclear facility as a shield. So there would be limited fighting around the shield. So it's really a question of, can you get enough guys in place fast enough in order to to leverage the nuclear reactors as a shield, because the Russians wouldn't want to indiscriminately open fire on the facilities as well. That would not go over well on the global stage, and that would certainly, that in of itself, just the threat of a possible incident might bring NATO into the conflict. And this is something that is important to remember, that even if there isn't a nuclear event, this will be a talking point that we need to secure the 6 largest nuclear reactors in Europe, and probably one of the largest depositories of spent nuclear fuel. This is going to be the argument. So regardless of whether or not this happens, it will be used as part of the excuse for the fast tracking of Ukrainian integration into NATO. Now, we have the wind direction, which is going to be shifting soon. This is alleged by some sketchy sources, I'll say, on the internet, that always make claims about sketchy things. The wind direction is a moot point. It doesn't matter which way the wind is blowing. In fact, typically, the wind in this region is blowing all over the place. It's somewhat seasonal, but regardless, if radiation goes up in the air, it's going to eventually cross into NATO's borders. And even if we just see a slight uptick in the surrounding nations of Moldova, Poland, and even the Baltic states, Belarus and Russia will definitely be impacted. The Black Sea will be impacted. Maybe it blows down into Turkey and Bulgaria. It's very possible. Even if a little bit, even if you see minor spikes around here, that could in and of itself be justification for NATO to invoke Article 5 and in some capacity get directly involved in this war. And when that happens, that's when things ratchet up in terms of the use of nuclear weapons. Because of course, as NATO force is, as a collective, larger than Russia's, as a collective, if every country kicked in all of their militaries, then they indeed would be able to potentially overwhelm the Russians. But again, the interoperability of that, you have different languages. So when you have one unified force like the Russians with 1 million guys ready to fight, many of them battle-hardened, even if you have 2 million troops from this skeleton crew of other countries who are not entirely 100% interoperable, they don't all speak the same languages, coordinating maneuvers like that is going to be difficult. So a consolidated, uniform army of 1 million could probably take a disjointed army of 10 million. So the Russians still have the advantage even if NATO enters the conflict, but this is what Russia has been preparing for, a direct fight with NATO. But the thought is, if they feel overwhelmed, after NATO gets involved, after the radiological incident that gives them a license to get involved, then Russia may feel the need to utilize tactical nuclear weapons, and then of course things escalate rapidly to the strategic nuclear level, and the shit hits the fan. Other data points to consider. Russian troop movements in the Melitopol direction, I talked about that already. I talked about even if it's just hype, that can drive an intervention. I explained that argument. There is ongoing media hype on a daily basis, whether it's the Washington Post, the Daily Mail. Again, a lot of these sub-mainstream agencies, media agencies, are the ones that are talking about this right now, but it's enough to prime the population and for Ukraine to say, I told you so, and we warned you. In fact, I'll show you a propaganda video that was released just today that does that very thing. We have Ukrainian general mobilization in other oblasts in anticipation of the fact that maybe the counteroffensive isn't going so well and they need more manpower. The European instability that we are seeing in France. A lot of people are saying, Nate, why aren't you talking about France? Well, I have talked about it. There's not much to say. It's France. Every year or so, you get massive riots and unrest in the streets, and nobody does the whole revolutionary uprising thing better than France. And I'm not saying that's what this is. This is just indiscriminate looting and rioting and the destruction of businesses and the exploitation of one unfortunate incident with the police, in which indeed it appears as though the police may have overstepped their boundaries. But all this is going to do is give justification for even more police state control. So it's always going to backfire. The reason why I don't talk about it is I feel as though that this will likely be quelled in the coming days and weeks ahead, and it's not going to be that significant, although it appears as though it is spreading. Could this be a George Floyd thing that carries on for months and months? It very well may be. It's definitely indicative of a deeper underlying issue, socioeconomic issue with Europe, and that, of course, is related to the ongoing conflict, because it's a sign of the future that if people are rioting for these reasons right now, imagine when the real austerity kicks in, when the energy prices go up again, when the weather doesn't cooperate over the next winter. That's when you're going to see the real rebellions begin, and the disintegration of NATO countries, and possibly the disintegration of the NATO alliance as a whole. And that is the whole attritional strategy that Putin is trying to employ right now in order to break NATO. Now, that European instability is going to increase desperation, though. And all that's going to do is compel NATO to be even more hawkish, because that's all they know in these types of situations. There's no reverse gear for them. Greta Thunberg in Ukraine is very significant, because what they've wanted to do, they know that she has a massive following. As much as some of my viewers might not see eye to eye with Greta Thunberg, understand that she is very popular with the younger generation, to the tune of millions and tens of millions of people liking her tweets. That was evident in the whole Andrew Tate Pizzagate type situation, right? So if they put her in the same room with Zelensky, I think it's for the sole intention of making the association of environmentalism with Ukraine, that Ukraine is the green, pro-progressive, liberal or neoliberal in the minds of anybody paying attention, agenda, and that Russia bad, Russia nuclear bad. They want to make these associations that Russia is anti-environment and they're destroying the planet and yada, yada, yada. And in spite of the fact that Nord Stream and all this stuff, all this has really done is increase the amount of energy that needs to be used to get things done. And of course, war in of itself is highly energy intensive and has a massive carbon footprint in and of itself. So they did this distinctly, I think, and especially around the timing that they did, to create that association with green Ukraine, good guy, green, and now Russia, again, the pariah, the nuclear pariah, right, who's going to contaminate the planet with its toxic radiation. Again, I must repeat that the IAEA chief, Rafael Grossi, does not corroborate Ukraine's claims that they have intelligence that suggests that there have been explosives put in sensitive places in and around the nuclear power plant. Now, you can see by the headlines, okay, that clearly this is being talked up. Why would he give this address? After all I've just told you about, all the civic defense drills, the safety drills, the distribution of potassium iodide like this is ThyroSafe. You can get that through the link in the description below. The distribution of various different types of CBRN equipment and all of the things that I've just listed off. Why would you give an appeal against the backdrop of a nuclear power plant like this? Well, it's to continue to add to this narrative. And you'll see that all Western media is doing right now is shaping and setting the stage so that when it does happen, people will immediately blame the Russians, okay? That's what they're doing. So Ukraine says Putin is planning a nuclear disaster. These people live nearby. So look at the framing here. Ukraine says Putin planning a nuclear disaster. So Putin planning a nuclear disaster. They're not saying that Ukraine has proof. They're not saying that they, the Washington Post, agree with Ukraine. They're just saying that Putin is planning a nuclear disaster, and that's what Ukraine says, because 99% of people don't read beyond the headlines. And so this is what 99% of people are going to believe. And you had Greta Thunberg in there just recently, so they'll make that unconscious association, and it's all subliminal at this point. And I'm not saying it's a big grand conspiracy. I'm just saying that this is how these things typically work. All right, it's it's very serendipitous for NATO if it all plays out in the way it does. This guy is a very pro-Ukrainian account. Russians sent letters to members of the UN Security Council promising it does not plan to blow up the nuclear power plant and blame Ukraine if it does blow up. Will blame Ukraine if it does blow up. He claims that Russia mined the nuclear power plant months ago. Recently, they planted more explosives. Again, the IAEA doesn't corroborate any of this. So they're just saying this, right? Ukraine-Russia war, latest, we are preparing for explosion at Zaporozhye. Again, notice the headline. This is from another pseudo-mainstream source, sub-mainstream source, and we are preparing for a nuclear explosion. So they're not distinctly saying that Ukraine isn't going to do it to absolve themselves of any sort of bad journalism or claims of bad journalism. They're just saying that they're preparing for a nuclear explosion and that it's probably going to be Russia's fault. Here's another one that's a bit more direct, and this is from a direct pro-Ukrainian source. Russia planned to blow up Zaporozhye nuclear power plant has been drafted and approved. How did you get that information? Why would Russia draft and approve such a thing? Okay, and why would that not be top secret? And how were you privy to that? This is according to Ukraine's chief military intelligence. Again, the U.S. intelligence does not corroborate that because the U.S. is trying to pretend as though they're not involved in this conflict, even though we just seen Senator Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham just a few days ago come out and say that we are going to get involved if there's any radiological incident in Ukraine, okay? Zelensky, and this, again, they put his name. This is what Zelensky is saying, but they know what people are going to make. Russia may be preparing to trigger a nuclear power plant explosion, according to Zelensky. They don't put somewhere in the fine print that there was no evidence to support this claim. They just put the headline there for a reason. This is another really sneaky trick. This is Sky News. Ukraine war latest. Ukraine preparing for nuclear explosion at power plant. Russia cancels major event over security concerns. These are two unrelated stories, completely unrelated. In the first one, they're talking about preparing for nuclear explosion at the nuclear power plant. The second is Russia cancels major event over security concerns. They're talking about an air show that was canceled in Russia. Completely unrelated to this, and that was for, of course, the concerns over security concerns as a result of the Wagner uprising. But they're trying to make that association once again, that Russia is canceling events over security concerns to make it look like, you know, the Russians are preparing for something. This is just a separate story. 40 Russian diplomats and embassy staff to leave Romania. Romania, indeed, would be one of those countries that would be in the pathway of a radioactive cloud of debris that would be the result of an explosion there. This is from the Daily Mail. Zelensky warns of serious threat at Zaporozhye nuclear plant amid fears Putin's troops are preparing to blow up the facility as Russia launches overnight drone attack on Kiev after a 12-day break. So on and on and on. ABC News, Ukraine prepares for possible nuclear attack. They do all the drills. And it was a very, you know, you don't get cinematic photographs like this without having like professionals on site to film this in the way you want it to be filmed. So maybe they were just trying to get put some B-roll out there to pay for all the money they're going to have to pay back. This guy, Mr. Look Over Top of the Glasses, Russian terrorist attack on ZNPP to be considered as a nuclear weapons use. This information just came out today. Part of Rosatom employees leave Russian-occupied nuclear plant. About 100 employees of the Russian nuclear monopoly have left. And this is according to the town's mayor. Now, we don't know why they left. Again, did they evacuate because the Russians are planning something? Did they evacuate because the Ukrainians are planning something? Did they leave because there's nothing left to do because the plants have been shut down by and large? We just don't know. Okay, so we're just kind of taking a lot of this is coming out of Ukraine. And contrarily, the Russians aren't saying much to their defense, which is typical with Russia, that they have a really bad PR game. If they do try to respond to these things, they tend to be very quiet in terms of their response. It's not something which tends to make it to their major mainstream headlines there. Their major state-sponsored headlines, and the representatives will dismiss the ideas, but it'll never really get published in any way, it seems. So this is what we have going on right now. This is a nuclear sniffing plane that is currently being sent to Ukraine, well, not to Ukraine, but in and around the Black Sea and the surrounding regions, in order to do surveying of and sensing of different radioactivity levels in and around the region to determine whether or not there's a nuclear explosion in that region, or if there is any sort of radiological event. So, and this is in direct response to these concerns of the Ukrainian government that there might be a radiological incident, okay? We also have, like I said before, I'll just, you can go and find this clip online. It's readily available for everybody to see, but this is Rafael Grossi. He's the IAEA Director General, not this guy. This is the dipshit pundit here. But this guy over here, he's basically saying that we don't really have any evidence to support the claims that Russia is installing explosives in around the power plant, but we can't say that they won't do that in the future. So you can see where the interests truly lie here, in spite of the fact that he doesn't want to admit that there's any explosive in the spent fuel pools or anywhere around the plant which might be subject to creating some sort of incident, that you know, he's open to that possibility. I mean, you can see here, right, where the interests of these guys lie. So, you know, he's kind of trying to play both sides of the fence there. This is an interesting one. I want to show you guys this video. This is a propaganda video that just came out recently. Now, in the background, right now, I'm not going to play the music, but in the background, there's all kinds of dramatic music playing right now. So this is a clear-cut propaganda message. But there's a little Easter egg in here that really caught my attention. Now, this is what they claim. We warned the world. The Russian Federation, together with certain collaborators, mined the dam last year. That's what they claim. And we were ignored, they claim. Then, of course, the Kakhovka Dam was blown, as we all know, created a large ecological disaster. Now we are warning you again. Russia is preparing to conduct a terrorist attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. It's important to note, just remember, that when that dam was blown, all of the Russian fortifications on the left bank were wiped out. The majority of people affected were Russians in that case. Now, there are claims that the Russians did this to limit the advance of the coming Ukrainian troops across in that direction, but I guess we'll never know. We just have to use our brains. I know it's hard for some of us. Russia is preparing a terrorist attack on the nuclear power plant, and they show you a bunch of different footage here. Russians want to blow up the plant. You should know that. They want to do that. This could cause a disaster not only in Ukraine, but more importantly throughout Europe. Now, this is where it gets weird. Because see, this footage here, this is Cliff from the Urban Prepper. So I don't know if they just were skimping out on their Shutterstock subscription or their Getty Images subscription, and they decided to steal some footage from fellow YouTubers. But understand that Urban Prepper, they're watching your channel, okay? So they actually use stuff, and they even use his daughter, which is kind of, I don't know, that's not really cool. But anyways, they're warning, it's very dramatic. They're saying, we warned you, yada, yada, yada. Russia must withdraw from the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant before it's too late. Now again, what's going to happen if there's an offensive in this direction? What happens is that all they need to do is give it a try. All they need to do is create some sort of offensive maneuver in that direction, whether it's a success or not. If they are then able to do some kind of detonation of the nuclear plant, in tandem with that, then it will appear as though that the Russians were fleeing and they were the ones who decided to detonate a bomb or whatever at the nuclear power plant. Now, if they do, and if they are successful in pushing the Russians back, and they still do it, which I don't see why they would do it, right? I don't see why they would, in saying all that they've said now, it almost sets it up so if they were to capture the nuclear power plant, people would be saying, well, didn't you just say that the Russians wouldn't let you capture the plant and that they would blow it up? So why isn't it blowing up, right? So was that just a backup plan that you had in your back pocket in case you were not successful? something to think about. Either way, the risk level right now, I think, is sky high, and it's higher than it's ever been before, and these guys know it. These guys know what's coming up. This was before the Wagner rebellion, but they're specifically talking here about proposing a resolution that would bring Article 5, invocation of Article 5, and bring NATO into the conflict if there was a radiological incident in Ukraine. Okay, so keep an eye on the radiological maps. Obviously, if something happens, you're going to know right away, and you're not going to be able to avoid this kind of map. On a day-to-day basis, this is nothing to really look at. It's just watching grass grow. Again, in terms of the wind direction, it can go anywhere. It's erratic. It's rather moot point. It doesn't matter where it's blowing. Eventually, some of that radioactive dust is going to blow into a NATO country, and that is going to be grounds for involvement in the conflict. That's all I got for you guys today. Again, I could probably sit here and show all kinds of videos of the craziness going on in France, but it's all just more of the same. It's par for the course. We're entering the age of consequences, the age of austerity, and you need to prepare. Stay ready, and don't forget, support the channel by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care.